copy. You have a hard copy. You have a copy on your computer.
Exactly. And I have the space for it. So then we know we're all set.
Okay, that's very good because try me. I buy a new computer when mine is full, and I'm getting really close.
God, I
I'm
aspire to
not
be able to.
joking. I'm not joking. I'm serious here.
Oh my God. That's amazing, Christina.
No, that's really bad. I mean, given that I'm a media conservator, this is really ridiculous.
I'm impressed.
Uh,
It's like when you play tennis and you break your strings. That's like a sign that you're doing really well. A sign that you fill
I
your
don't,
computer up, I think, is a
I,
good
I
sign.
don't think this qualifies, and I know that Thomas B has some thoughts. Do you want me to admit people so you don't have to worry about it?
Do you mind? We'll just start doing
Yeah,
that.
sure. Yeah,
Perfect. Perfect.
Can you just confirm that you can only see the slide?
yes.
So right now I can see the slide and I can see you.
Okay, but you don't see the notes.
No.
I do not see the notes. No.
Okay,
How
good.
did you manage doing that? Do you have two monitors?
I do not have two monitors. If you go to advanced screen sharing, you can
Oh,
share just a portion of your screen. So I can have PowerPoint open like normal and see my notes, but you guys can only see my slide.
that's a very good piece of information.
Yeah, I found that out before the last presentation because, you know, I have all these notes and I didn't want other people to see them.
Yeah, I mean, look at me. This is pathetic. This is what I was working on because I didn't figure it out the last 3 hours.
Well, my plan last time was if this didn't work, I was going to have my other computer open and just do one on one and one on the other. But thankfully this worked because this
That's
is a lot
super
better.
good to know. Advanced sharing settings.
Yeah, I can send you the link to there's this whole article that tells you all these different things you can do with Zoom as far as sharing with two monitors or one. I'll send it to you. I'm sure it would be helpful.
Cool. Thank you. That is super helpful. Okay, my light situation is a little weird here as well.
Cody, I just want to let you know, some friends are going to be on tonight, and they live on Long Island, or they have a house on Long Island, which is on a bay, which has a lot of algae in it. So they're very curious about planting oysters and using oysters to attack that algae problem. So I just wanted to let you know that you're going to get some questions about that.
Okay.
I will be back
I'll
in a
try to
minute.
answer as best as I can.
I will be back in a minute.
Okay. Thomas is going to be on too. I forewarned him that that these questions are coming. So you start with it, and if you want to refer to him, refer to him.
I'll do that. Oh, I've got to get a glass of water real quick.
Mm-hmm.
Hello,
Hi, William. How are you?
I'm fine.
Oh.
Cody, are you working on your presentation right now?
No, I'm not. I just had it muted because Jacob was in the other room on his phone, but no, I'm not.
I am. Can you get to the Zoom link and send it to Mike Carew? I don't want to mess with the screen right now because it's
Yeah.
close to the beginning.
Oh, hold on. I can do that easily on my other computer, actually.
Oh, great. While you're at it, can I just give you a few names to send it to?
Yeah.
So
Hold on. I'm going to just forward. I'm going to
Yep.
forward your original message.
Perfect.
Okay. Go ahead.
So Mike Carew.
Is it just Mike at Captain Mike's Diving?
Yes, I think so.
Okay. Okay.
Maria Caruso.
At gmail.com.
Yeah.
Okay.
Barbara Delensick.
Okay.
Barbara Z cannot make it tonight. I don't want to nudge her. Let's do.
She saw it last time.
What's that?
She saw it last time anyway.
That's right. That's right. Rose Rodstrom.
Okay.
Paul Mankiewicz.
Okay.
Aji Henderson.
Okay.
Orion. Lily Reed.
Okay.
Linda Baldwin.
I don't think I have her email address.
Okay. Don't worry about it then. Just send it to those guys.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, it's in non-oyster related news. One of my dogs had to have all of his teeth pulled out last week, except for 2.
Oh, poor baby.
And he's fine. He just, I mean, they don't, dogs are resilient and he doesn't care, but it's been very entertaining the last week because his little mouth is so funny now.
God, how's he chewing?
So that's a good question. I've been feeding him soft food. But he's one of those dogs that doesn't chew his food anyway. He just swallows it.
Yeah.
So I don't think he really cares. I think he's fine regardless.
Good.
But he only has these 2 bottom teeth, so his lips get stuck and he just has these 2 little bottom teeth. It's
Poor baby.
entertaining.
God. That's I had a dog named Dylan years ago when I was living back in Tarrytown. He did have good eating habits. Sometimes he had tooth problems. When he got too old, when he put his leg, we had to euthanize him in 2015.
Yeah,
So
that's unfortunately the sad thing about owning pets.
that's and then yeah, now I'm living up in Millwood. I have a cat named Billy Bob.
Oh.
Causes problems and the house. And so,
Cats are troublemakers.
yeah, pretty much. I'll warn you about that if you get a cat. And
Hello.
I told my
Hi. Hey, Thomas.
Hi.
Hey.
Cody, did I mention to you that we have a 17-centimeter oyster in Buckley Cove?
Oh, wait.
oh my gosh.
In Buckley Cove, where is that?
Well, that's right off Buckley Street. This little cove to the right. So, and it's unattached, sitting on
Oh.
pebbles.
Oh.
Very well watched. So.
Yeah. That's exciting. Did you name that one?
I did.
Christina, how many would you say are in the cove?
40.
Is that right?
And
Wow.
many of them are unattached. And interestingly enough, they don't move much.
That is interesting.
That
Right?
is interesting. Like with all the big storms, they don't get, sloshed around.
And I'm wondering if it's maybe partially because it is this cove shape and the current just, keeps them there and pushes them there. I don't know.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
I never seen that, so definitely need to check that out.
I will introduce you all to her if you want.
Good. Yeah, I need to see that on my bucket list for sure.
Christina, can you see the people in the waiting room?
Yes, I'm admitting.
Oh, okay. I just wasn't sure. I'm like, I wasn't sure if the co-host went through. So you can see them. Good.
Yeah, I can see them. If you could just, once you get started, please remind everybody to mute
Yes.
themselves, and then I will
Yes.
go through the list and
Yes.
identify.
I'm happy to admit people when I'm not speaking. I was like,
I
oh,
don't worry about it.
okay. Oh, nice. Someone from BOP. Katie's
Oh,
blue shirt.
Katie.
Katie.
Yeah.
Hi, guys.
Hi, Katie. I'm glad you could join us.
Of course, wouldn't miss it.
You're going to hear about your 4 oyster research stations.
Great.
Leah, those are great photographs.
I'm just having some fun.
Where's that behind you?
It's all Iceland.
Oh, cool.
Always changing them. Kind of fun to find the right one for the mood, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Holler if you need me.
Should we start it's 7:04, start in a minute or so?
Yeah, I think that's fine.
Okay. Should we get going?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. So I will, I'll start. I think we're going to get going now. We have a bunch of people already on, and it's a few minutes after 7. I want to welcome everyone to tonight's lecture. It is, we are having a data collection progress update by Cody Carroll, who is our fantastic intern with the City Island Oyster Reef organization. We've, as we build the City Island Oyster Reef, known as CIOR, as many of you know, we remind ourselves, why are we doing this? And, why are we engaged in working with the City Island Oyster Reef organization? And one of the core reasons is collecting scientific data, is doing just this and reporting back to the community on what we are finding around City Island and in the waters on City Island. And Cody has summarized the work that City Island Oyster Reef has done in 2019 and 2020. She's a master's student at Hunter College in their Animal Behavior Center, and was originally recruited by Dr. Heike Neumeister, who is a founding member of the City Island Oyster Reef. She was mentored by her as well. And currently she studies under the direction of Dr. Thomas Preuss, who is a CIOR advisor. Tonight, as I mentioned, Cody's going to go through the work that was done in 2019, where many bags of loose shell were hung from various docks around City Island. And she's going to talk and give an accounting of the biodiversity that came into those bags, and in terms of oyster recruitment. In 2020, City Island Oyster Reef was very fortunate to be given oyster research stations from the Billion Oyster Project, which is a large nonprofit in the New York City area working to bring oysters back to New York Harbor and elsewhere in waterways throughout New York City. So we received these last summer. We had 3,600 little baby oysters, and we've watched them grow, and Cody oversaw the monitoring of those oysters. So you'll hear about that as well. Over the past year and a half, City Island Oyster Reef has been super busy combing the beaches of City Island under the direction of Christina Frohnert. And they have looked and found both dead and live oysters that are sort of naturally occurring around City Island. And that will be reported to as well, or reported on as well. So tonight, it's just important to note, really, this is one of the key functions of City Island Oyster Reef, is to gather this information, to analyze this information, and to use this information to help work towards environmental and ecological rehabilitation. And keep in mind too, it's the result of like hundreds and hundreds of hours of volunteers, board members, City Islanders, people from throughout Westchester, the Bronx, coming in from Manhattan, really working to collect this data, to monitor the oyster research stations, to scour the beaches and marshlands of City Island. and to study these bags of loose shells that were hanging from the docks around the island. So it really represents a lot of work done by many individuals. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to you, Cody. Your presentation, I know, is about 30 to 40 minutes. And then afterwards, Cody will take questions. And if you wouldn't mind muting yourselves unless you're speaking, that would be really helpful. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you, Sally, for the introduction. And yeah, thank you everybody for being here. I'm really excited to share these updates with you. This was a presentation that I gave to the board back in January, so I'm hoping that everybody else finds it interesting and informative. I do just want to take a minute, Sally did this as well, but I do want to take a minute to recognize Heike. I'm sure many of you knew Heike. Unfortunately, she passed away last year, but I just want to take a minute to thank and acknowledge her for the great deal of work that she did on this data. She initiated and collected a lot of it. So, you know, just we're really grateful to her for beginning that and for all the collection that she did. And just on a personal note, you know, I'm really grateful that she brought me onto this project and that she was willing to, you know, mentor me. So yeah, let's go ahead and get started. So beginning in 2019, the City Island Oyster Reef Board of Directors and a group of dedicated eco-volunteers began collecting data with a goal in mind to restore oyster reefs around City Island. Now, a year and a half later, thanks to that vision and dedication, we have one complete study and 2 ongoing studies from which to continue this data collection and eventually present to the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation in order to obtain the necessary permits to begin oyster reef restoration. Oh, sorry, my PowerPoint froze. I want to begin today by discussing some relevant information about oysters and oyster reefs. Then I'd like to provide updates on the data that has been gathered so far, beginning first in July of 2019 with a pilot experiment intended to study natural recruitment of oysters and biodiversity. Then moving on to January of 2020, when beach surveys of natural oyster populations around the island began. And then most recently, the development or deployment of 4 oyster research stations in August of 2020. And then lastly, I'd like to talk about some of our goals for continuing data collection this coming year. So to begin, let's talk a little bit about the reason we're doing all of this in the first place, and that's the oysters and oyster reefs. And I do just want to give credit to Dick Sadler for this photo on the left. I don't think he's able to be here tonight, but I really love that photo and I wanted to make sure he had credit for it. So just a little bit about the anatomy of oysters. Oysters are bivalve mollusks. They have a hinged shell. That shell is made mostly of calcium carbonate, which is excreted by the mantle's edge. The adductor muscle is the muscle which allows oysters to keep their shell tightly closed. When we're searching for live oysters on the beach, doing beach surveys and monitoring the live oysters, we explain that dead oysters can be identified by seeing that they are slightly open. The reason that dead oysters are slightly open is because of the relaxation of that adductor muscle when they die. The hinge that you see at the top of the picture is what actually keeps the 2 halves of the shell together. The gills of the oyster are used to bring in food, and it's moved over the gills and then into the stomach and digestive tract. So oysters are filter feeders. The drawing of water over the gills and filtering out of food particles is how oysters provide the valuable service of cleaning the surrounding waters. Oysters open their shell and pull water across their gills, and as the water passes over, the gills filter out phytoplankton and small bits of algae, releasing clearer water. Nutrients that the oyster consumes are incorporated into their shells and tissue, which is of course why it's unsafe to consume oysters from particularly polluted environments. Oysters excrete both feces and what is known as pseudofeces. Pseudofeces is a collection of unsuitable food particles which are encased in mucus and then expelled from the oysters. This will be important. I'm not just telling you this for fun. Both feces and pseudofeces are then deposited and incorporated back into the benthos. So one of the benefits that we talk about a lot with oysters is how they filter the water. And a big component of that is removing nitrogen from the water. And that's where that feces and pseudofeces deposits comes into play. So whenever they remove the nitrogen from the water, as some of it's incorporated into their shells and their tissues, and then some of it's excreted, the nitrogen is deposited back into the sediment, and then it undergoes a process called denitrification, in which nitrate is turned into nitrogen gas and then released back into the atmosphere in a biologically inert form. So in addition to feeding and excreting, oysters also reproduce, of course. In the first step, environmental cues trigger the oysters to begin spawning. So in this first picture, you can actually see the oysters spawning. Those clouds of white that you see around the oysters are actually the eggs and sperm. They release that into the water, and then they're actually fertilized in the water column. Environmental cues trigger the oysters to do this. Those cues include temperature and salinity increases, usually 20 to 30 degrees Celsius or 68 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit, and salinity above 10 parts per 1,000. Once an egg is fertilized, it then becomes a larva, which you can see here in the center. The larva will float freely through the water column, and then eventually it will reach something called the pedovelliger stage. So you can see in this middle picture, there's a black spot in the middle. That's going to be an eye spot. And then on the right-hand side, you can see something hanging down, and that is actually a small foot. Once the larva reaches that stage, it begins looking for a hard, suitable substrate to settle on permanently. Once it lands on a suitable substrate, it begins excreting a strong glue comprised of calcium carbonate and protein, which will permanently attach it to its chosen location. It is at this point that the oyster becomes known as a spat. And if you look at the picture on the right, you can see the larger shells are actually clam shells. And then on the clam shells, those smaller brown spots are oyster spat. And some of you may recognize this picture. This is actually from our oyster research stations given to us by Billion Oyster Project. So these are the actual spat that we put into the ORS stations back in August. As this cycle occurs, larvae settle on top of one another. The spat grow vertically into juveniles and adults, and then oyster reefs are formed. Picture here are two miniature oyster reefs from our oyster research stations. So these are actually oysters that have grown from this picture on the right. They've now grown into small reefs. And you can see how the oysters, the larvae settle, or the spat is flat on the shell, but as the oysters grow, they actually grow vertically. So now let's talk about a little bit of the research that's been done at City Island so far. Data collection began in 2019 with a pilot experiment designed by Heike Neumeister for the purposes of understanding natural oyster recruitment, which is the settling of spat onto a hard substrate and the accompanying biodiversity. You can see a picture in the picture on the left, Heike and Chandler actually examining one of the cages that they had deployed. Then in January of 2020, beach surveys began for the purposes of assessing the natural oyster population around City Island. And in the middle, you can see a picture of Christine Fraunert, who has taken up the beach surveys as her passion project. She's been very dedicated to the beach surveys. And then finally, I want to talk about the August 2020 deployment of 4 oyster research stations. Again, those are provided to us by the Billion Oyster Project, containing oyster spat settled on clam shells, which we are monitoring for oyster growth and survivability around City Island. And then on the right, you can see Sally Connolly and one of our eco-volunteers, Janine Higgins, measuring and counting those juvenile oysters from the ORS cages. Let's talk first about the pilot experiment. In July of 2019, 20 plastic mesh bags were halfway filled with cured oyster shell and hung from 5 docks at City Island. The cured oyster shell was intended to provide oyster larvae that may be in the water column a proper substrate to settle on. 4 cages were hung from each dock, with the exception of the consolidated dock where 8 cages were hung. And then 2 chicken wire cages were included as a control, which were hung at gateway. Each bag was monitored one time for possible settlement of oyster spat and for biodiversity, including the control cages, which did also attract some biodiversity. Monitoring consisted of removing the cured shell and any animals from the bags, placing the animals in tanks to be photographed and later measured, and then sorting through the cured shell to identify spat. After monitoring took place, any biodiversity found was released, and any spat found was placed into a metal cage for future monitoring. The cured shells were then returned to the Pelham Park landfill to be used again. And here you can just see a map of the 4 locations where, or the 5 locations, I'm sorry, where those bags were deployed. So on the left, you can see one of the plastic mesh bags that contain the cured oyster shell. Again, those were filled approximately halfway. And you can see on the right some of the more plentiful species that were discovered in the bags, such as shore shrimp, mud crabs, and oyster drills. Each bag and all species found in the bags were photographed with calipers for the purpose of later identification and measuring. So you can see in the pictures the calipers placed in the bottom of the tanks of water where the biodiversity was placed so that we could later have a reference for measuring them. And here we have a log that was created for each location, showing the date and status of each bag that was monitored. And on the top right, we have a photo of Sam Smith, who is one of my fellow master students in the Hunter ABC program, and Sally Connolly sorting through that cured shell looking for oyster spat. And on the bottom right, you can see another photo of a toadfish and a blackfish, which are being photographed with the calipers, again, as a reference scale to be measured later on. So this graph shows the total number of species that were found in the 20 bags and 2 control cages. A total of 967 animals were identified, comprised of 35 different species. The species seen most frequently was mud crabs. And this data is again taken from one monitoring of each bag and control cage. So in comparing locations, we see that the highest number of animals were found at the Consolidated Dock and Tier Street Dock, with the highest diversity of species at Consolidated and then Gateway. Consolidated, however, if you'll remember, did have a higher number of bags than the other locations. So to account for the differences in the number of bags at Consolidated versus the other locations, we can take a look at the number of animals and species found at each location. When looking at it from this perspective, we see that the Tier Street Dock had the highest mean number of animals and diversity of species. The other goal of this study was to determine whether there were oyster larvae present in the water surrounding City Island. Out of the 20 bags of cured shell, only one location saw any oyster spat recruitment, and that was the Consolidated Dock. A total of 5 oyster spat were identified and marked at that location. And on the photo on the left, you can see there's 5 shell that have string around them. Those were the 5 spat that were found at Consolidated during their last monitoring in 2019. In December of that year, they had a mean size of 27.26 millimeters. When we monitored them again in October of 2020, all 5 of those oysters were still alive, and they had a mean size of 62.04 millimeters. Oysters typically grow 25 millimeters or about 1 inch per year. So we are seeing pretty typical growth with these oysters. Unfortunately, during the last monitoring, the identifying numbers were no longer visible. So the next step is going to be to identify the individual oysters by the shell that they originally settled on, if possible, and then compare them individually. So what these oysters tell us is that viable oyster larvae is present in the surrounding waters of City Island. Okay, so next, in January of 2020, surveys of the beaches around City Island began. The goal of these surveys was to identify and assess native oyster populations around City Island. On the right, you can see a map of all the locations that were surveyed in 2020. So we've covered quite a bit of the island. There's still a few gaps that would be nice to get to, but for now, we feel we have a pretty representative view of what the population is. So the beach surveys are performed by walking along the beach and checking any walls, rocks, and piers for the presence of oysters. This is typically done at low tide, so the largest area possible is accessible and visible. The beach itself is also combed for oysters, which are less frequent in the sand, but still occasionally found on the beach itself. Once an oyster is identified, a caliper or ruler is placed next to it and a photo taken. The oysters are then placed into a size category of less than 5 centimeters, 5 to 10 centimeters, 10 to 15 centimeters, and greater than 15 centimeters, and then marked on the beach survey form. The beach survey form, pictured on the right, is used to collect the location, weather, sediment, and tide information, in addition to the size and number of oysters found. On the left, we have a couple of pictures of our excellent eco volunteers. We have Ellen Grace Zaltis on the left. And then on the right, we have Christine Fraunert. It looks like she's measuring an oyster that she identified on a rock. So this chart shows the number of oysters categorized by size found at each location that was monitored. Each location has only been monitored one time to date. Cross Street, Kilroe, and PS 175 have the highest number of total live oysters. In looking at the number of live oysters by direction, the graph on the left shows a larger population of live oysters on the east side of the island than on the west side. In the graph on the right, I've sorted the total population by direction and size. And here you can see that the east side has a larger population of oysters under 10 centimeters, while the west side has a population of oysters larger than 10 centimeters. This indicates that more oyster spat is being recruited and settling on the east side of the island, which complements what was found in the 2019 pilot experiment, where the only oyster spat found was at the consolidated dock, which is on the east side. The west side indicates an older population of oysters with less recruitment, although we do see some young oysters on the west side. And lastly, but most recently, we deployed 4 oyster research stations, which again, provided to us by courtesy of the Billion Oyster Project, for the purposes of understanding how well oysters placed in the water would grow and survive around City Island. Each cage contains clamshells, which were seeded with oyster spat. The initial count showed 3,451 spat placed into the water. 1 cage was placed at Tier Street, 1 cage at 89 Horton, 1 at PS 175, and 1 at Consolidated Yachts. The cages at 89 Horton and PS 175 are hung from moorings, and the cages at 21 Tier Street and Consolidated are hung from a dock. To date, these cages have been monitored 3 times by pulling them from the water and removing the clamshells in order to count and measure the growing oysters. You can see on the right just a map of where those locations are exactly. On the top left, you can see a cage that has been removed from the water for monitoring. Specifically, this is the cage from 89 Horton. As soon as the cage is removed, we immediately place the oysters into buckets of water. Volunteers then typically work in groups of 2. 1 person counts and measures, and the other records the data. As we count and measure, we are looking for 2 things: remaining spat and oysters that have grown into juveniles. Any oysters under 15 millimeters, we count as still being spat, and any oysters larger than 15 millimeters, we consider juveniles. The spat are individually counted, and juveniles are individually counted and measured. Once all oysters have been counted and measured, the cage is scrubbed of any fouling that has accumulated. And as you can see in that picture on the top left, on that cage, it was particularly heavy. So we cleaned it off so that the water can continue to flow through easily. And then the oysters are carefully placed back into the cage and put back into the water. So this chart on the left shows the mean growth of the oysters in millimeters in each cage. This includes juveniles only, as again, we only count the spat. We do not measure them until they reach 15 millimeters. As you can see, there is steady growth at each location and between each monitoring. While I originally expected to find higher growth on the east side than the west side, we can actually see more variation within the east and west side, with 21 Tier and Consolidated showing the highest growth, followed by 89 Horton, and then lastly PS 175. We can see that within the first 2 months of deployment, the oysters grew quite a bit, more than in the third month, which is to be expected based on the water temperature and the pattern that BOP explained we would see. And then the table on the right just shows the mean growth between monitoring dates. In comparing the 4 cages to each other, based on the number of spat that were initially placed in each cage, we can see that Consolidated is currently showing the highest percentage of survival, followed by 21 Tier Street, 89 Horton, and then finally PS 175. Another component of monitoring the oyster research stations has been water quality monitoring. Water quality testing is performed using the YSI Pro DSS, which provides us with 6 measures by which to judge the quality of the water. Monitoring is currently performed at the same time that the cage is monitored, and the sample is taken at the site of the oyster cage. The first measure is dissolved oxygen. Healthy water should typically have 6.5 to 8 milligrams per liter, or 80 to 120%. But oysters can survive in different measurements. They can survive in 4.5 milligrams per liter or 20%. Overall, we don't see much variation between the 4 locations. We do see the most variation at PS 175. Specific conductance, which is simply how well the water can conduct an electrical current, and is measured in microsiemens. Again, we don't see much variation between the 4 locations, but we do see the biggest difference between the 2 monitorings that were done at PS 175. The next measurement is temperature. The average range is 2 to 24 degrees Celsius, or 35 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit, but oysters can tolerate -2 to 29 degrees Celsius, or 28 to 85 degrees Fahrenheit. And we see very steady temperatures across each location at each monitoring. The next measure is salinity. Oysters can tolerate levels from 5 to 35 practical salinity units, but their ideal range is around 15 to 20 PSUs. So we see that the range around City Island is within the limits of tolerability, but perhaps a little higher than is ideal. And then pH is next. The tolerance level for oysters is 6.5 to 9. Estuaries tend to remain around 6.5. And again, with these results, we see a range that is suitable for the oysters and little variation between the 4 sites. And then lastly, turbidity. It's the measure of the relative clarity of the water, measured in FNUs. The ability of animals to survive in turbid environments is highly dependent on the level of turbidity and the amount of time that the animals are exposed to that level of turbidity. For a reference point, drinking water is typically less than 1 FNU. Turbidity is the one measurement where we see quite a bit of variability in the data. This could be due to the constantly fluctuating nature of particles in the water or due to a sampling error. It was pointed out to me that at this measurement, the second measurement at PS 175, we did have someone standing in the water and taking the measurement, which could have disturbed the bottom and brought particles up and could contribute to that outlier we see of 12 FNUs. So to conclude, I want to talk for a minute about our 2021 goals for data collection. First, we want to improve our methods for monitoring water quality. I mentioned when we were talking about the turbidity, possible sampling errors. By getting more samples, we'll be able to reduce that possibility of sampling error. We want to establish new protocols for the water quality monitoring. We were given some excellent tips from Save the Sound that we want to incorporate. We want to monitor with more frequency. We want to expand where we monitor and include the locations of the beach surveys. And then lastly, we want to train more people to use the YSI Pro DSS so that we can expand our water quality monitoring. Next, we want to perform more beach surveys, but instead of simply surveying the same beaches again, we want to concentrate on tracking specific populations. We want to look for newly recruited oysters, and we want to develop protocols for tracking individual oysters. And then lastly, Billion Oyster Project provided us with some recommendations on other areas of data collection we could focus on. One of those is sediment analysis. So we want to take some samples of the sediment at locations where we are actually interested in placing oyster reefs in the future. Habitat exchange, referring to the developing a written plan, explaining how oyster reefs will improve on the current environment. The adaptive management program is a plan for how to manage unexpected and possibly undesirable environmental changes after placing oyster reefs around City Island. And then lastly, creating size frequency charts of our ORS cages and the beach surveys to provide to the DEC. Thank you all for listening. I really appreciate you being here again. And I just want to acknowledge a few people. Of course, the City Island Oyster Reef Board of Directors, our project advisors, Allison Fitzgerald, Christine Fraunert, and Peter Linderoth, all of our wonderful and dedicated eco-volunteers. We have a lot of people who have spent a lot of time collecting this data. Again, they're very dedicated. Everyone is really hoping that this project will succeed. So I just want to thank them. And then our partnership with Billion Oyster Project, Hunter College, Animal Behavior and Conservation, New York, New Jersey Baykeeper, New York State DEC, and Save the Sound. And then again, I just want to give a big thank you to Heike Neumeister, and then Thomas Pruce, who helped me with this project, and my second reader, Diana Reese. And that's it. I'm gonna stop sharing. Or should I leave it up? Sally, should I leave it up?
Maybe stop sharing and then people can see each other.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
It was
Let's give a hand for Cody's. Let's give a hand for Cody's presentation. That was great.
Yay, it was great.
Fantastic.
I'm happy to answer any questions that I'm able to answer. Ed, I think you might be muted.
We can't hear you, Ed. I think you're asking a question, but we can't hear you.
His volume might not be up on his computer or laptop.
Oh, I'll put it in the chat.
Sometimes that happens.
We still can't hear you, Ed. Does anyone else want to chime in with a question? It was an excellent presentation, Coney. You put together so much data from 2 years worth of work, and it's not easy doing that and making it understandable to so many of us who are not scientists. I mean, there are scientists on the call, but for those of us who are not, you make it very understandable, which is great and really kind of eye-opening in terms of what's going on in the waters around City Island and here, here in Western Long Island Sound.
I have a question.
Maria.
Thank you, Cody, it was great. When you were mentioning the new protocols, trying to design new protocols, have you thought about any specifics? I'm just interested as far as both the water quality testing and the beach surveys and all of that. Have you thought about what the new protocols might look like?
So Save the Sound provided us with some really good details on how to get better measurements. Whenever we're doing the water quality monitoring now, I only put the probe in the water near the cage. And Save the Sound recommended that we do a little bit differently. He recommended we take measurements at different depths in the water. And of course, that we do it more frequently. He also recommended different calibration techniques than what I've been doing. They calibrate with much more frequency. So, those are a few of the ones that I can think of off the top of my head. I think Peter probably gave us some more that I have written down somewhere that I'm just not thinking of. We're actually meeting on Sunday to get started on kind of getting some other people hands-on with the equipment so that people are comfortable with it. So yeah, those are a few of the things I can think of. For the beach surveys, I mean, I kind of have ideas of what I would like to do with that. I'm sure Christine does too. Christine, if you want to chime in, that's fine. If you can think of something off the top of your head, no pressure, but you know.
Yeah, I also just remember that Peter recommended to us with regard to the water quality measurements that the measurements should ideally be taken not later than 3 hours after sunrise, which also
Yeah.
creates some logistical challenges in order to
Yeah.
do so. That's another reason why it probably really comes in handy if more of us are getting familiar with the equipment. With regard to beach surveys, I think by now we have a pretty good understanding of the overall distribution of native oysters around City Island. And I think we want to develop a methodology that is approved by the board, but of course also by other collaborators to see if this makes sense moving forward. So current thinking is that some of the most popular native oyster spots on both the east coast and the west coast of City Island are identified, where we monitor living oysters attached and unattached to a substrate, which will be challenging. So we have to think about how, if and how we tax them, if and how we wanted to have additional water quality measurements that are supporting the data of the monitoring of the native oyster population. So we are currently in the process of performing some pilot monitorings, I would say, just to inform future methodologies, but we'll certainly run it by a larger audience moving forward to develop a methodology that we hopefully are able to set a baseline in April, so we can really start collecting data once the oysters start growing in May.
And Christine contradicted me because I said that we don't often find oysters in the sand on the beach, but she just told us that she's found quite a few. So hopefully nobody else was on the call early enough to hear that.
Well, it's surprisingly, there are quite a few large ones at the east side of Belden Point and here in Buckley Cove. And according to what we learned in the last webinar, please correct me if I'm wrong, smaller oysters are more likely to be male, and then they switch sex and are more likely to be female when they are larger. So that would mean there's a larger population of males on the West Coast.
That would be an interesting way to start categorizing them.
Sorry, that was too much information, probably.
And one of those other tests, I don't want to sound like a total moron, but one of those tests that started with a TUB something or other.
Turbidity.
Now, is that the clarity of the water? Because she was saying, what is that again?
So turbidity measures the particles in the water. So, you know, for the example I gave, drinking water has a measurement of 1 FNU because it's very clean. It's very clear and pure for us to drink. So it measures the particles that are in the water. It actually, the probe shoots out a light and that light bounces back. And that's what tells, you know, that's what tells the probe, like how far away the particles are, how many there are. And it helps us to understand not necessarily what is in the water, but how many particles are in the water, which is, you know, you want some particles in the water because the oysters need something to eat, but you don't want so much that light can't get through. You don't want there to be too much turbidity. Yeah, did that answer your question?
Yeah, you know, it did, but I was going to say, because at one of our other webinars, Mike Carew, who's on our board, was mentioning diving and over by Jack's Bait and Tackle, and one day it was the water was very, very cloudy and not clear at all. But he was talking about possibly taking water samples and having some labs test those water samples. Will those results and will that data be incorporated into your data as well?
I mean, that would be interesting. I don't know what Mike wants to have test. I don't know what he wants to test for specifically. He might be wanting to test to see what is in the water, like what specific particles are in the water, which would be interesting to know. So I should talk to him about that. I'll see him Sunday, so I can chat with him about that and see what exactly he's trying to test for.
Because we were possibly thinking of having it, we talked about having it being tested in Tomas's lab. So.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no, we didn't test anything yet. We need first the samples, and I guess it's really just how much. It's one measure how much substance really is in the water, so to speak. Yes, and he was interested in that, and it doesn't necessarily mean that we know what the substances are. It's just really the amount. So, but you know, there's always possibilities. You can go in any detail you want to. I think we should also think really about how to deposit really oyster shells, because to collect more oysters, really, oyster shells from all kinds of sources, because at the end of the day, I think we are on the way to identify where to put them. I guess now we have to maybe also think about how to get as many oyster shells, because they seem to like really oyster shells the best to settle. How to get the maximum amount of oyster shells we can get, so to speak, to deposit them. I guess that should be another thing where we could get probably all the help we can need to do that. I think that would be for me an avenue to do.
Cody, sorry, I just had a question.
No, sorry, go ahead.
On your presentation, have you been able to draw any conclusions, or is it just too early to do that about, you know, growth? What's inhibiting growth? What's promoting growth? What sides of the island and why some are growing in one way versus another?
So I'm going to say no, because this, for me personally, for the work that I'm doing, this was more of an initial look at all the data that's been gathered. I don't feel that we've drawn any solid conclusions. As far as looking and comparing the different sites, like for instance, the ORS growth we've seen, we still need to run the stats on that to get, an understanding of which site is quote unquote, better for growing oysters. We still have to run the stats on that. And then as far as understanding what's contributing to growth or lack of growth, I think that the water quality sampling needs to be, that's one of the reasons we want to work on the water quality sampling, because we need a lot more samples to understand what's going on in the water. And also we should be getting some, or we're hoping to get some continuous data loggers soon that we can put on the cages, and that will give us a constant measurement of the water, so we can constantly see what's happening, and that'll give us a much better idea of what could be contributing to where we're seeing more growth, than other locations. So I wouldn't say we have solid conclusions. I think this is a good first look at what we're seeing, and then obviously throughout the next year we'll be able to draw more conclusions from it.
That would be very, very interesting, the conclusions from this, especially when it comes to water quality and just growth rate.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there will be more presentations later on.
This is going to be the first of many reports to the community. But as Cody mentioned, just to shed a little more light on it, the Save the Sound is going to be gifting us these 3 water quality monitors, which will permanently be in the water at 3 sites around City Island starting the end of the summer. And we have to go out and monitor them on a bi-monthly basis throughout the winter. So it's getting continuous data every day, and then download that information. So it's going to be really exact information starting the end of August, and it'll be continuous for the next, X number of years. So that'll be really a great way to kind of see what's going on with the water in terms of these various elements.
So since Ed is muted and he can't be unmuted, I
Oh.
see he put a question in the chat. What is the purpose of measuring electrical conductivity?
So conductivity along with turbidity, but conductivity also tells us how many particles are in the water, both dissolved and dissolved and actual particles floating in the water. It contributes, it's similar to turbidity in what it contributes. They kind of work together to tell us that.
Does that answer your question, Ed? Good. Does anyone else have any other questions about really anything also CIO related? A lot of this is going to be kicking into gear again, the ORS monitoring and water quality monitoring starting April. So, and shell collection is starting up in March. Thanks to BOP, we got a permit for shell collection to cure and collect shells at the Pelham Bay landfill. A lot of volunteer activities are going to be starting up again, and we would love people to be involved. So if you're not already plugged
Sally,
into the system, yeah.
I was going to say, since you brought up volunteers, both Lee and Mary Claire mentioned to let them know if we need volunteers for water quality testing or any other testing. So I don't know if you want to let people know how they can, get in touch with us to volunteer or to find out when we're going to be doing, training and things like that.
I will let you know. Lee, do you mind just sending me your information? I'm not sure I have it. Because I'd like to, we're going to do a big training. And so we're going to be doing a training on Sunday and then continuing to train volunteers throughout the spring. So I'd love to get you involved in that. And I also have a presentation that Peter Linderoff did for a few of us, and I can share that with you. So just give me your information. Mary Claire, I have your information, and Lee, just if you could send me your contact information, I'll be in touch with you.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I remember when we did the monitoring in the summer, and the cages were getting very crowded, and it was a concern because it was hard to extricate the oysters, and we were talking about maybe getting bigger cages. So I was wondering if that's happening.
Well, do you want to answer, Cody, or do you want me to answer?
Well, you might have some information I don't have, Sally, but from from like a scientific perspective, switching them to a different size cage might not be the best idea for for analyzing the data later on. It's probably best to keep them in that same size. But I would also say we should find out what BOP does in that situation, because I'm sure they have experience, with the oysters possibly outgrowing the cages. What are their protocols in that situation, or what do they recommend? That's my thought on it.
I can chime in if that helps.
Yeah, Katie.
Yes, please.
That would be great, Katie.
Yeah, so that's a great problem to have when your oysters outgrow their cage. And you want to give them a little more room, because if they grow too big for their cage, they can start growing through the mesh, and then you'll damage them, or you won't be able to take them out to measure them. And sometimes that happens, and we say, well, that's okay. We'll leave them in there. And if that starts to happen when they're small enough, they'll grow right out through the holes. And then we'll just leave them in there and measure them that way. And we have protocols for doing that. However, if it's the situation where they've grown a lot and then they start to get wrapped up in there, and the jostling may cause breakage, then you might want to gently try and take them out and put them in a new cage. And we can certainly, help you find different types of materials that will be suitable or help you make a bigger cage or set of cages.
Do you have a, like, sort of a standard neck size up that you would go to if that is the case?
We do make our own cages, so we will typically use something that's a little bit bigger if we know that things are likely to outgrow their cage. And we have a lot of different types of cages as well. So in the case where we know like the purpose is to let the oysters grow really big, we have a couple different strategies. One might be to put it in the type of cage where the oysters will move inside of it, which will keep them rolling and will keep them from growing through. And that's sort of an aquaculture technique, because as that happens, it knocks off the growth edge, and then you wind up with like a deeper cup with more meat, and but that might not necessarily be what you want. If you're what you're actually trying to gauge is how are the oysters going to perform in an on bottom situation. Which I think
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's interesting though, that you do, when they start, possibly outgrowing the cages they were put in, that you do move them to something else. That is good to know.
Well, I should say we don't typically do that. I mean, our larger scale community size projects we use the, I don't know if you've seen them, we call it a community reef. And it's a structure where oysters hang from a welded frame, and the frame sits on the bottom, and then the cage hangs from the frame. And I think those cages might be a little bit bigger than what the ORSs are, but maybe what we should do is set up like a Zoom next time you guys are out in the field, and you can show us what they look like, or one of our folks can come out and just look at stuff with you, and we can think about the best way to keep them happy.
Yeah, that would be great. That would be, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I remember the last time we went out, like Ellen Grace was saying, some of the cages were really stacked with a lot of oysters that had grown. It was
it was hard to get them out.
Yeah.
And it's hard to get them back in.
And then,
you have to put them in very specifically to get them to fit again.
Right.
Yeah, we can help you with that, sure.
Which is
great.
It's a great problem to have, because they're growing, and it's a good thing.
May I ask a question related to the monitoring of the live oyster populations that are unattached on the beaches? Maybe Katie has some ideas. So besides the fact that we have to identify a method to identify the individual oysters, which can be like using tags that we attach to them, still to be determined. Alan Grace brought up this question whether or not there is an additional benefit if we would weigh the individual oysters in addition to the measurements we are taking.
So I wouldn't recommend weighing them unless you were doing it as part of a protocol in the lab. And the reason is because you don't know necessarily how much, when the last time the oyster brought water inside its shell. And so without actually drying the meat, you won't know how much is water and how much is tissue. But you can do that in the lab. You could send them, if what you're actually interested in is the condition index of the oyster, then you can do that, and you can send it over to Bassam Alam, and he could do that for you. And then, there's other things that he can do as well. And it's not, the disease testing, the pathology is fairly expensive, but you could do even reproductive health if that was one thing you were interested in. I think it's like, $30 an oyster or something like that. You do that a couple times a year, and that'll tell you how the gonads look. And he'll give you some other information as well. He'll tell you if there's parasites or things like that. And And then in terms of I think your other question was about doing a shoreline survey and tracking individuals. I think that's an interesting question. It's not something that we do any longer. It's something that we've tried to do at various times, but we found that we get more information about trends if we're tracking the larger population, because the tracking individuals is very labor intensive. It's very hard. The little things always fall off, and like then they get mixed up and you're like, is it this one? Is it that one? And sometimes we try just putting nail polish on them. That seems to work.
We tried that too. It washed off already.
Washed off, yeah.
Yeah, it's really hard. But I feel like, you'll get a better sense of what's happening in your broader location by looking at the trends of larger surveys. So think broad, get as much, data from different places as you can. And I wouldn't worry quite so much about the individuals, unless you had a real reason to do that. Like if you were, like maybe comparing a particular treatment. One treatment against another. But
well, I've started identifying them a little bit over the course of the last couple of months, and the interesting thing that I found out is that they actually don't move that much, especially the larger oysters. So this is why we were debating with the thought of whether or not we should continue doing so in the more intertidal zones around City Island, where we have actually identified the larger oyster populations.
Yeah.
Oyster population.
Yeah. Well, that's really interesting. So one way you might handle that is if what you want to know is, are they moving in and out of different locations, which we do track that. We call that transport. And we do have a protocol we've used over at Soundview, because we were getting a lot of we call it off-reef transport. And that's a problem, because if what you're trying to report on is the performance of a particular reef area, and you come back a year later and you have fewer oysters, you want to be sure that you can show that it's not due to mortality necessarily, it's due to off-reef transport. And so we do find it's helpful to not only measure if you suspect that's what's happening, you want to also measure or count the number of boxes of dead oysters, and then also take care to do like a little survey around your reef area and say, oh, look, here's my oysters, they're over here, and then just note that in your study that you are experiencing transport. And that's why you wind up seeing, you probably read a lot about this in other studies, that people will take pains to do things that will limit transport. Like at Soundview, what we do is we stagger the materials. So we'll do a big gabion and then some space, and there'll be shell on the bottom there in anticipation of transport.
So that would mean we ultimately have to tag them in some way in order to identify the transport, right?
You could do that, but you might lose them, so, and then there's risk in that, because you invest a lot. So you want to you have to get inside their little, they don't have brains, but you want to figure out where are they going.
And we are also collecting boxes and measuring boxes. So in moving forward with the hopefully soon established monthly monitoring, so we will really look at both the growth rate and the mortality. That was the idea, if we decide to do so moving forward.
Yeah. Good.
Thank you so much. This was super helpful. I was curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Anytime.
Well, it looks like no one has any more questions, or so.
Sally, would you mention something about the Bronx Park Speak Up?
Yes, we have this this Saturday is the Bronx. There's a coalition of all the Bronx parks, and they are hosting a virtual event. They typically have a community conference this time of year, but because of COVID, they can't. And so they're having Bronx Parks Speak Up, a virtual get together. And everyone is invited. And it's a great way for you to introduce yourselves or to find out about nonprofits and parks related and environmental groups in the Bronx area. So if anyone is interested in getting more information on it, please, let either myself or Maria Crusoe know. CIOR is hosting a virtual table. We put together a slideshow for the event, but there are a number of organizations throughout the Bronx who are participating. So it's kind of a cool and really fun get together.
It's from what, 10 to
11. It's short.
10 to 11, 1 hour.
1 hour. So if you're interested, let Maria know, let me know, and we'll point you in the right direction. But it was, in terms of this evening, Cody, it was such a great, thorough presentation of so much data from a couple of years. So we're so thankful to you for that. And also so thankful for all of your hard work and dedication to the project, because not only are you an intern and you're working on your master's thesis, you go so way above and beyond the call of duty in working with all of us. And we've learned a lot from you and together with you. And we are so grateful really to have you part of such a key part of the team.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I enjoy it very much. And I know I've told you, but I'm so grateful that I'm able to be a part of it, and for everyone who has helped me and has spent a lot of time, helping me put this together and doing the data and collecting the data. It's definitely a big team effort. So thank you to everyone. I really appreciate it. And I'm really happy to be a part of it.
Absolutely.
And thank you everyone for being here and listening to the presentation.
Yes, thank you so much for joining this evening, and for Katie from BOP, our partner extraordinaire, who they're always helping us at every turn. They're there to support us and push us in the right direction. So thank you, and for everyone who came out this evening to listen to Cody's presentation. Be in touch. We'll be in touch. Bye now.
Bye. Thank you, everybody. Have a good night.